No worries. So today we're focusing on the topic of why it's so important that activists and advocates alike are using the word abortion. So we have seen politicians, educators, and activists all using phrases like reproductive health care or reproductive choices when what they really mean to say is abortion. When abortion is so violently under attack across the country and abortion ballot measures are popping up across the country, we can simply not afford to be confusing people about what abortion is. When someone says reproductive health care is under attack, reproductive choices are under attack, it doesn't have the same effect as when we are clear about saying that abortion and access to abortion is under attack across this country. Not talking plainly about abortion leaves so much room for interpretation that we really don't have space for in this critical moment or ever. Avoidance of using the word abortion for people in our movement really further contributes to abortion stigma. For those of you who are not aware, abortion stigma refers to a shared understanding that abortion is morally wrong and or socially unacceptable. A lot of people's avoidance to talk about abortion in public stems from very deeply rooted abortion stigma, which can be extremely dangerous to both abortion seekers and abortion providers. Stigma shames and silences people who, as I said, both provide and get abortions, but it also contributes to a lot of myths and misconceptions about abortion. It's really important to remember, again, that when we don't talk about things plainly, especially critical, necessary medical procedures, it makes them seem a lot more rare or dangerous than they really are. We know that the majority of people in this country support access to abortion, and avoiding talking about it plainly really perpetuates a narrative that abortion is not popular or normal or safe. With all of this being said, it's really important to take a look at the current administration. The Biden administration has actively avoided on multiple occasions using the word abortion throughout their time in office. During his 2024 State of the Union address, President Biden did not use the word abortion one single time, despite the fact that Dr. Jill Biden's guests to the event were Kate Cox, who had been impacted by an abortion ban in Texas, and a couple who had been impacted by the IVF ban in Alabama. Despite all of this, President Biden did not say the word abortion once. Instead, he used words like reproductive choices, healthcare that she needed, or restoring Roe. What makes this even more interesting is that the word abortion was written into the physical version of Biden's speech that was released to the public multiple times, but he neglected to say it in the actual address, and again, opted for phrases like reproductive choices and restoring and codifying Roe. It's very clear that these very tactical and purposeful deviations from using the word abortion really further perpetuate abortion stigma. Another example of this is that in the administration statement for the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, the word abortion was not used one single time. This isn't just a Biden administration problem. We see a lot of politicians at large, even those who support access to abortion in some way, using phrases like restore Roe and codify Roe instead of talking about what they actually mean, which is increasing access to abortion. Centering abortion policies around Roe, which we know did not protect abortion access for all, even when we did have it, is very disappointing, especially considering the fact that the majority of people in the country support abortion access. Next slide, please. So now we come to the question, even more so, of why should we be saying abortion? A very important statistic that we don't address enough in this movement is that the anti-abortion movement and anti-abortion extremists use the word abortion 4 times more than pro-choice and pro-abortion advocates do. This means that anti-abortion extremists are framing the way we talk about abortion. So when we're using euphemisms for the word abortion, it really does give the opposition and anti-abortion extremists control over the narrative. Especially because when anti-abortion activists use the word abortion, they're using it as a bad word. We know that abortion is not a bad word. It's popular, it's safe, it's normal, it's common, which is why it's really important that we retake this monopoly over the use of the word abortion. Even more interestingly, according to research, people who are actually seeking abortions and people who find themselves in medical settings prefer that the procedure be referred to as an abortion, not as a termination of pregnancy or a reproductive choice. When abortion seekers are seeking care, they want that care to be called abortion. It's really important also to realize that as a society, in most cases, we often mirror the language we hear used by healthcare professionals to describe our healthcare choices. So this is why it's really important that when healthcare professionals are saying abortion, that we're adopting that language as well. We know that there's already so much mystique about what an abortion is and what it entails. There's confusion between what a medication abortion is versus an in-clinic abortion. And our movement should not be actively contributing to this confusion by avoiding using the word abortion. So as we said, using the word abortion reduces shame and stigma around the procedure and simply normalizes it, which is what we all wish to do. With that being said, we're going to get started with our amazing panelists today. Our first panelist is Garnett Henderson, she, her pronouns. Garnett is the senior multi-platform reporter at Rewire News Group, the only national outlet focused on reproductive and sexual health, rights, and justice news. Prior to joining RNG, she spent a decade as a freelance journalist reporting on the intersections of health and culture, with a particular focus on abortion access. Since 2020, she's been the host and producer of Access, a podcast about abortion, a show that challenges dominant media narratives related to abortion through first-person stories and expert perspectives. Garnett's work has been recognized with a Deadline Club Award and a National Headliner Award. She is a 4-time grantee and fellow of the International Women's Media Foundation. Her work has also been published in The Nation, Cosmopolitan, Elle, Scientific American, Marie Claire, Guardian US, Wired, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Amazing. So we would love to get your perspective as a journalist. How have you seen your peers, whether at your organization or others, avoiding using the word abortion or avoiding speaking frankly about reproductive health care?
Sure. Well, working at Rewire now, that's not something I see just because we're the only national news outlet that's focused on reproductive and sexual health. But as you mentioned when you were reading my bio, I was a freelancer for a long time before I came to work at Rewire. And that meant I was often working with new editors at different publications really frequently. And I will say, I think I have seen a lot of improvement over the last 10 years or so in terms of journalists actually saying the word abortion. I don't think it's very common that you see journalists use a euphemism when they mean abortion, but I do think that journalists, especially political journalists, could do a much better job of asking politicians follow-up questions, because they do so often use euphemisms and use really vague language. And I think too often those really vague quotes are just kind of dropped into a story without any follow-up, which means that readers aren't actually getting the real information about what political candidates' stances on abortion are. And then I would also say there are lots of issues with journalists using outdated and or just medically inaccurate terminology. When I was a freelancer, I had to fight many editors to get them not to use the phrase late-term abortion. Now, something I see a lot now that the anti-abortion movement has started calling medication abortion chemical abortion. I'm also seeing that repeated a lot in the news. I'm seeing phrases like, heartbeat bill, heartbeat ban repeated really uncritically, even though that is not a scientific idea, right? The idea that there's a heartbeat at 6 weeks. And so for me, those are really the more kind of nuanced things that I would like to see my fellow journalists do much better.
I'm really glad that you mentioned particularly things like heartbeat bills and the terms like late-term abortion. I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on why you think reporting using anti-abortion language instead of scientifically accurate language is harmful to readers and consumers of this information.
Great question. I mean, I think that a lot of that language is stigmatizing and confusing. And as you said in your introduction, it makes abortion seem dangerous and scary when in fact we know abortion is incredibly safe. And it's certainly much safer than pregnancy and childbirth. And it also just creates confusion. I mean, what I find in my work is that there's a total information vacuum around abortion. I think because of stigma, a lot of people know very little about the specifics of abortion. What does the procedure look like? Or what does it look like to take abortion pills? How do you do that? How do you get an abortion? You know, lots of people really are not thinking about these things until they're in a position where they need an abortion. And I think having information out there that is vague or confusing just makes things harder on people. And it also violates kind of a basic tenet of journalism, which is that the idea of who, when, what, where, why, how, that those are the basic facts that you should be giving your readers in any story. And then lastly, I would just say that, you know, the anti-abortion movement is incredibly intentional in how it uses language. Again, as you've already mentioned, they have invented terms like late-term abortion, partial birth abortion, chemical abortion, again, with the sole purpose of stigmatizing abortion, with getting anti-abortion legislation passed, and they've been extraordinarily successful at that. And when the media repeats those terms uncritically, it's not showing quote unquote both sides. It's actually putting your whole, you know, hand on the scale in favor of the anti-abortion movement if you accept their framing and their language on every single topic.
I think that's such a great point. And I was just wondering, to counter that, can you kind of describe the approach that Rewire takes to tackling topics of abortion and what kind of language that is used there?
Sure. So I would say first and foremost, we always aim to use medically accurate and up-to-date terminology, and also to explain things that people might not know, and to be specific and explicit. Try to avoid anything that is euphemistic or vague. So for example, instead of heartbeat ban, well, first of all, if I were to use that term, I would put it in quotes, right? To indicate that that's what some people call that type of ban. And then we also would just be explicit and say that that is a 6-week abortion ban, or that is a near total abortion ban, because that tells readers what they actually need to know. Heartbeat ban doesn't tell you anything about at what point abortion is banned in your state, right? Even if that weren't a political or stigmatizing term, it's confusing. So we try to model that kind of approach we'd like to see from other media organizations. And we also try to push back on other publications when we see them doing things poorly. And I try, you know, like I do outside media appearances, for example. Sometimes when I've written a story that is bigger and people are more interested in it, I'll do, sorry, I live in New York City, there's an ambulance passing. But sometimes when I do a story that is bigger and there's outside interest in it, I'll do media appearances, I'll do interviews and talk about it. And I always try to make sure and push back when I notice other people are using that kind of euphemistic or inaccurate language when they're talking to me or talking about my work, just so that their audience hears that and so that they hear it from another journalist as well.
I think that's so valuable, and obviously we're very thankful to you for doing that and for Rewire for spearheading that kind of work. Could you just speak briefly to how you feel that this approach that's different from a lot of other media organizations has impacted and educated readers, and any feedback that you've received?
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot from people who just say, thank you, I was really confused about this until I saw your article or your tweet or your TikTok or whatever. And so I always really appreciate that. I'll have people reach out directly to me wanting to share their own abortion stories or experiences they had encountering barriers to abortion because of the laws where they live. And to me, the fact that my work makes them trust me and want to reach out to me in that way is something I'm really proud of. And then I also do think that because Rewire is a specialist publication, we do stories that other publications probably would not publish because they consider it too niche. But sometimes that niche reporting is really important, both in terms of how abortion bans affect people on an individual level, but also in terms of the anti-abortion movement and what it is doing and how they're achieving the many things that they've been able to achieve. And I do think, often without crediting us, I will say, other publications do then pick up on that stuff and run with it and do their own reporting, which, even though, as you can hear, I get a little annoyed that they do it without credit, I do think it does help get those stories to larger audiences. And so I do appreciate that. I also just want to say a lot of the improvements I've seen in actual terminology have come because of the changes to the AP style guide, because almost every news outlet in the country follows the AP style guide. And I know that that actually came from a lot of really hard work from advocates, not necessarily from journalists. And that was really important, and that made a really noticeable difference in the field, I think.
Thank you for that. I wanted to hone in a little bit on the anti-abortion movement and the way that they use language. I think we've seen a lot in the abortion-related ballot measures that are coming up that the anti-abortion people in different states are being very specific about what kind of language is used and are really trying to dominate that narrative. So I was wondering what you thought in that current climate when we're seeing a lot of these abortion ballot measures. How do you think saying the word abortion and encouraging others to do so can really help the success of these type of measures?
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, anti-abortion groups are never afraid to say the word abortion and to make abortion sound horrible and barbaric, right? And that goes way, way back to the mid-19th century and really like the foundations of the anti-abortion movement. I've been working on a book project, and I'm doing a lot of research into the origins of the US anti-abortion movement, and they really are just recycling all the same talking points hundreds of years later. And I would say that especially Democrats still are really afraid to actually use the word abortion and talk about abortion directly. And the thing about that is that a lot of people have, kind of a vague understanding. Like maybe they know that their state banned abortion or has made it harder to get an abortion recently, or that that's a risk. But like I said earlier, a lot of people don't really know the nitty-gritty details about how do you get an abortion and where would you go and how much would it cost. So they don't necessarily have something to compare to. And they might not really understand the specifics. Like, I'm thinking of the great researcher Katrina Kimport did this interesting study where she found that when people have fatal fetal diagnoses in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, they often think that their state has an exception that will apply to them, but that exception doesn't exist. And this was before Roe was overturned, right? I think lots of people, we do this kind of magical thinking of like, well, I'm sure if I really needed an abortion, there would be a way. And the answer in so many states was and is no, actually, you would just have to leave. You would have to go somewhere else. And so I think if you want people to actually understand the stakes, you have to be really explicit. You have to make sure there's no room for confusion about what is and is not legal and accessible right now. And, you know, especially if we're talking about a ballot measure, how your ballot measure would actually change that.
I think that's such a good point and such a great note to end on as far as focusing on demystifying what abortion is and what is available and accessible. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, please put them into the chat and we will come back to you later. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, next it's again my honor to introduce Sarah Lopez, who uses she and her pronouns. Sarah is a born and bred Texan, abortion doula, abortion storyteller, and the organizing manager at We Testify, an organization dedicated to the leadership and representation of people who have abortions. While seeking support after her own abortion, she learned about abortion funds and has previously worked at Fund Texas Choice, Jane's Due Process, and as an advocacy fellow for the Texas Equal Access Fund. Sarah's passion for the work stems from her personal experience and a commitment to cultivate spaces that offer love and support for people who have abortions and fight for a world beyond stigma, criminalization, and oppression. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to circle back to the amazing organization that you're a part of, We Testify. I was hoping you could explain to us a little bit about We Testify's purpose and belief behind creating the Did Biden Say Abortion Yet tracker, which I feel is infamous to most of us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm also going to put it in the chat just for folks if y'all haven't seen it yet. But yeah, the thinking behind this particular campaign was really around being upfront and confident in challenging our so-called supportive elected officials. And President Biden ran on a pro-choice platform, and yet for, I believe it was something like over 400 days when he was in office, he still hadn't said the word abortion yet. And so this campaign was really around saying the word abortion, around challenging our allies and our elected officials to say the word abortion and to stop perpetuating abortion stigma by, as we've talked about a lot today, relying on euphemisms or recycling anti-abortion talking points. A lot of the things that we touched on in the campaign is just that he had, removed the Hyde Amendment from the presidential budget, but still hadn't said the word abortion. In 2021, when the Biden administration held like a commemoration for Roe v. Wade, he still hadn't said the word abortion. And actually, it wasn't until hours after the leaked draft opinion that the Supreme Court would overturn Roe v. Wade that he finally said the word abortion. So it's really after we already are faced with the fact that we will no longer have the constitutional right to abortion that he chose to say it. And that in itself really shows how not saying the word abortion, perpetuating the stigma, it really just reinforces these anti-abortion talking points. And even the way he has talked about abortion, he has talked about how, being quote unquote pro-choice or like not saying the word abortion, it conflicts with his faith, which is also very super stigmatizing, because what we know is that a quarter of people who have abortions identify as Catholic, and even more identify as religious or people of faith. So when we see our president, who ran on a pro-choice platform, repeating these talking points, perpetuating the stigma, and reinforcing that you can't identify as religious or Catholic while also being pro-abortion, it's deeply concerning. So in analyzing the statements that he puts out, pointing out where he very easily could have said the word abortion but didn't, we are inviting our supporters and other people with a platform to say the word abortion and to be more pro-abortion in their stances and to move away from euphemisms, from flowery language, and from platitudes.
I think that was such a good point, especially when you're talking about politicians who are taking advantage of this moment of people being so passionate about abortion and abortion access, but then also at the same time not using the word. So I really am grateful to you for pointing that out. I would love to know, as an abortion storyteller yourself, how do you think hearing people's firsthand accounts of having an abortion can impact the way people talk about abortion or think about it in their own personal lives?
Thank you for this question. It's such an important one. So We Testify, we hold a lot of spaces closed to people who have abortions, so peer support spaces, trainings around abortion storytelling, and then also like in-person storyteller retreats that are just specifically for people who have abortions. And in these spaces, I really can't even count how many times I've heard our storytellers say that before they had their abortions, they didn't know anyone who had an abortion. But later they learned that that actually wasn't true. It's just that it wasn't talked about. And it wasn't talked about until they had their abortion or shared for the first time. A lot of people maybe shared with their mom or like their sister after they had their abortion. And then that is when they learned for the first time that someone like in their family, in their circle, a loved one had also had an abortion. And even for me, like when I had my abortion, I felt instantly held when someone close to me told me about their abortion and reassured me that I had done nothing wrong and that I was loved and that, it was, that I was supported. And I wanted to highlight that because by sharing our stories, we really are able to free ourselves from the internalized and societal stigma that might be eating away at us, and really find comfort in those who show us compassion and who tell us like, I've been there too, and maybe like my experience looked different, but like, just knowing that there is any overlap, whether it's, the year we had our abortion or like if we had surgical versus medical, like whatever it is that we can connect with, it really gets us closer to dismantling that internalized stigma that really permeates throughout society, not just in media or in the way people talk about abortion, but of course in policy, in the ways that abortion restrictions have really panned out, in the ways that friends and family talk about it or repeat a lot of like the misinformation that's in the news. And so when we share our stories, we let others know that they're not alone and that they have a trusted person that they can share their story with. And We Testify, we particularly focus on uplifting the stories of marginalized communities because these stories have largely been left out of public narratives around abortion, and so therefore these folks have not seen their experiences reflected, or especially the overlapping complexities around accessing care, especially for Black and Brown folks, young folks, people in rural communities, undocumented folks. We're seeing one or two depictions or versions of abortions, but not seeing the full breadth of people's experiences. And so by elevating these stories, we're able to change the conversation around abortion and make sure nobody feels left behind. And as a result, people hopefully, of course, like feel more comfortable leaning on the people in their lives. And if like that isn't, a source of support that they can go to, knowing that there is a soft place to land in, We Testify in a lot of the other orgs that are doing peer support and like unapologetic pro-abortion messaging, so that they know that there is a place that they will be welcomed with open arms for their experiences and to be able to share their story on their own terms.
That's so incredible, and I just want to emphasize how impactful the work that We Testify is, and everybody on this call who's not checked them out should definitely do so as soon as they possibly can. But I would love to ask you to kind of combine those two questions in a way. What impact do you believe it would have if our legislatures talked more plainly about abortion without euphemisms, but also if they're spending more time consulting people who have actually had abortions and understanding the real lived experience behind abortion instead of focusing on just policy measures?
Thank you. That is such a wonderful question. I think a lot of what yeah, I'll just repeat a lot of like what Garnett said earlier, just about how, you know, using these euphemisms as flowery language, it kind of got us to where we are now. And so by speaking more plainly, we move away from these compromises that we've made. Like, we didn't have to make these compromises, right? But that's what got us to where we are now. And so moving away from, and what I mean by that, we also have a campaign that's like, I'm pro-choice, but, which is really rooted in a lot of messaging that, again, we've heard from like allies, from so-called progressives, a lot of these, you know, well-meaning folks who are trying to, you know, be more outwardly pro-choice, but they'll say something like, I'm pro-choice, but only up to like X amount of weeks, or I'm pro-choice, but only if you have one abortion, right? Like more than one, then I don't know, or all these different talking points that just perpetuate the stigma and, you know, get us, move us away from abortion on demand, anytime, for anyone, any reason, and just like kind of push us like further back into compromises that keep access out of reach. And so if legislatures talk more plainly about abortion, it would allow, you know, their constituents, just like people in their communities, to know that even despite the current landscape, that folks seeking abortions would feel more affirmed in their decision and would likely feel safer leaning on loved ones or like reaching out to like abortion funds for support. It would just feel significantly less daunting. And I love the piece about the question that you asked, especially around turning to people with lived experience, and like getting, you know, allowing like them to take the lead. I think that some of the work that we've done, we do a lot of like partnerships, and we love when like an org, you know, if they're working on like a hotline or like some kind of thing, like some kind of resource to support people who have abortions, when they reach out to us and like want to hear directly from people with lived experience, like what kind of support would you have wanted in this, or like what would you have liked to hear in this campaign, or in this kind of, you know, post-abortion like survey support, things like that. When they get that kind of feedback, it just immediately allows, it makes space to provide people with the support that they deserve, and that we are looking to people who have abortions as the experts. And a lot of times, you know, we only see like doctors or lawyers as the experts, and they are, of course, like experts and like lead a lot of this really important work, but we also have to see people with lived experiences as the experts, and like being able to really tell us like what is going on the ground, like what this experience actually was like as someone who was seeking an abortion in this current landscape. And so also, I think by moving away from euphemisms, we can get more, I think, like buy-in from, you know, across the board, for people to understand that Roe was not enough. Legality is not enough. The systems that we have, they already weren't working for us. We have to dream bigger than the courts, than any elected official. We have to create the world that we want to see, where people are affirmed in their decision. They're given compassionate support, and they don't have to flee the state that they live in and like see, you know, horrible anti-abortion billboards on the way out of state while accessing this like time-sensitive essential healthcare. And so, especially in this moment, we really have to contend with the fact that, you know, messaging like restore Roe or all these things, it's not going to get us to where we need to be. And also that the reality is that abortion access is not really great anywhere in this country, not just red states, not just Texas, not just states where it's banned, but also in blue states. There might be states that have fewer restrictions, but, you know, if you live in California and you don't have, you know, a car or like transportation, it's still going to be hard to have to get to your abortion appointment. And so to make real, meaningful, long-term change, we have to be willing to challenge our allies to do more, to do better, and to demand that they do so, and to do right by people who have abortions, and not just to allow people to think that like, well, we're good, all we have to do is restore Roe and then everything will be fixed. And so even though we have a lot of work to do around this, we are, we see, I feel like every day, like people getting closer and closer to where we need to be to create this future that we're fighting for.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for lending your expertise to us. I really want to emphasize the fact that we should be centering people who've had abortions. They are the experts, and I really, really love that sentiment. Thank you so much for joining us. If anybody has any questions for Sarah, please put them in the Q&A box.
Wonderful. Thank you, Layla, and thank you, Sarah. And now I would like to welcome our last but not least panelist, Kimberly Little, uses she, her pronouns. Kimberly is professor of instruction in women's gender and sexuality studies program at Ohio University, where she has taught since 2004. She has a PhD from Ohio University in 20th century U.S. gender history with an emphasis on gender and civil rights movement. Her first book, You Must Be from the North, Southern White Women in the Memphis Civil Rights Movement, was published in 2009, and her current research centers on the nexus of reproductive justice, white supremacy, and the Christian nationalism during the Trump years. I'd also like to add that Kimberly Little is one of the best professors that I have personally ever had. Her diligence in this work and excellent skills as an educator encouraged me to think critically about my space in the world and led me to do what I do now. So thank you so much, Professor Little, for joining us. It's an honor to be able to talk to you today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Jess. You are so, so kind. It is my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here with y'all. Thank you.
Awesome. My first question for you is, as an educator, how do you hear your students speaking about abortion, and has it changed in recent years since the fall of Roe?
Yeah, great question. It sure has changed since the fall of Roe. And, actually things dramatically changed in the WGSS classroom after Trump's election. We've had a major sea change in our numbers and in the way that people talk, et cetera. But just a little bit of context for where I do most of my teaching these days, and that's in the intro to women's gender and sexuality studies, or I'm just going to refer to it as WGSS because it's such a mouthful. I'm currently teaching over 200 students in that class in different sections this semester. It's a general education class. And it's also a requirement for the School of Journalism, which is one of the largest schools at Ohio University. So we have an incredibly diverse group of students in that class. Obviously, we still have folks that are super charged up about feminism and wigs, but a lot of different voices are coming to the table in those classes. And what I have seen, especially after Dobbs, is many more students are speaking up in support of abortion. And many more students are likening these restrictive abortion laws to sexism and misogyny, and they love to talk about old white men. This is even before, like all the rhetoric we're hearing constantly about Biden and Trump. But a lot more folks really critical of the restrictions we've seen through Dobbs. We'd always seen them, but after Dobbs, and we're seeing, less folks being vocal, fewer opponents to Roe, fewer opponents to abortion. But those who are speaking up about their opposition are framing their opposition, the majority, 99% of the time, in their religious belief systems. And so that's really interesting. Another change that I've seen is that there is less talk, and I think Sarah was talking about this as well, of opposition to abortion. I'm pro-choice, but, and one of the more popular ways that students talked about that was, or more common ways students talked about that was, I don't believe abortion should be used for birth control, those sorts of comments. So, in all honesty, really far more support bearing out from the students, and this is showing up post Dobbs, and this is showing up not just in our classroom conversations, but also I asked them a huge essay question on abortion for the final. And my evals, it does not seem to be coming out even, under cover of the anonymity of course evaluations or their final exams. So there has been a change, and it's certainly a lot more supportive.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and good overall to hear, especially with all of the restrictions in the state. And it was already pretty restrictive when I was attending OU, and that was back when Roe was still in place. Thank you for breaking that down for us. My next question for you is, how have you found to be the most effective way to teach about abortion and the history of the reproductive justice movement? And does this involve speaking directly about abortion and the procedure itself, or more broadly, and its just ability to be accessed?
Well, thanks for that question, Jess. I teach, as y'all know from my bio, I'm a historian by training. So I teach it as a history, but specifically a legal history of abortion. And I do use abortion. I don't sugarcoat that or, vaguely reference it. And I do that in a number of different ways. One of them is that I start my conversations about abortion going back into, I focus on the United States, going back into the colonial era, like independence from England, and talk about the ways in which people who were like the Puritans, living in a time when the separation of church and state was less blurred than it is today. But of course, now, obviously, that's sort of a moot point, since we're clearly seeing the blurring of the division between church and state everywhere we turn. But I talk about how abortion was legal and expected, and was certainly used as a way to control your fertility. It was used as what we would think of as birth control, up into the point of what's called quickening. And that was the phrase used to refer to first fetal movement, which traditionally medical personnel have said occurs, late third month, fourth month, fifth month, so into the second trimester, as Roe divided up the pregnancy timeline. And so began kind of getting students used to the idea that, opposition to abortion and this current characterization of abortion as murder and, all of that is not linked in like some sort of static interpretation from Christianity, for example. So I start there and just sort of go through. I don't talk about the procedure per se. I do give students, and I just started doing this again after the fall of Roe, documentaries to watch where women specifically who have had abortions are very detailed about the procedures that they had, and the problems that they had when abortion was illegal. And then also there's another documentary that I used, and I can't of course remember the title of it now, but it was looking at the restrictions that we saw in the early 2000s, and talking with people who had had abortions then, and them describing the procedure. So I don't get into that particular in my lectures, but I do talk about abortion as a part of healthcare. I link fetal rights, the restrictive, the guaranteeing, obviously, of fetuses more rights than adult humans, as misogyny, link that as control of women and pregnant people. I also link reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and abortion to sexual liberation, talking about how, for example, the famous Combahee River Collective's statement, Black feminist organizing in the 1970s, where they completely tied bodily autonomy and reproductive justice to sexual liberation and the situation of specifically Black women's bodies as inferior, subpar, all of the different racist terminology that we have seen placed on Black women's bodies historically. connect it to sexual liberation. I'm trying to go fast. And the one thing that I do when I talk about resistance is I don't use the phrases pro-life and pro-choice. I use pro-abortion rights and anti-abortion rights because, and I know we've talked, y'all have been talking about the language. I think that when you look at choice, it is, and I think this is interesting when you look at what was going on after Roe in the early 1970s, it's viewed as something that's like personal. It's like you're making a choice like you have any other choice. And I think that that is not helpful in trying to teach students that this is not something that you can pick or choose. It's essential to many people's lives, if that makes sense.
That absolutely makes sense. And I really like that framing. So thank you for that. And for some of the historical context around abortion and what do you bring to your lectures. Yeah, it's great. And just, I'm so glad to have you on. My last question for you before we go into the next steps is, have you seen or learned about other progressive movements historically that have also struggled with the use of accurate language? And if so, what can we learn from them?
Yeah, great question. That final comment that I was making to your second question is a great segue to look specifically at what was going on with the abortion rights movement right after Roe in 1973. At that moment, and that's, 1970s in US history, we'd had the feminist movements were really starting to kind of start making some headway, get some attention and some money and some support. We also see the anti-feminist movement and the sort of rhetoric that we're seeing today coming out of, and I have just blocked the name of the Republican congressperson from Alabama who did the rhetorical to the response to State of the Union, that sort of idealized maternalist domestic ideal sort of scenario. People like Phyllis Schlafly in the 1970s arguing that if we get an equal rights amendment or if we don't fight to overturn Roe, women are going to destroy American society. It's only selfish women who choose to have abortions. All women, it's their natural state to be a mother. And so that whole choice use, I think, is a really, and both Sarah and Garnet talked about this, that really was a problem that I think has helped the anti-abortion forces jump in to that kind of language to start framing the narrative, which they have done for themselves. And, to just, obviously everyone is aware that the white-led feminist movement was very different from Black-led feminist movements at the turn of the 1970s. And once again, it was Black women who were not using that language, who were connecting abortion to larger issues involved in reproductive justice, like forced sterilization, Black maternal mortality rate, and this is Black Maternal Health Week, right? That they were the ones who were giving us the kind of rhetoric that we're now using today post Dobbs. But had we been doing that on a larger scale, had that gotten the airtime that Gloria Steinem and the white leaders got, who knows what sort of change could have happened. But that's a real, super germane to this conversation. There are plenty of other progressive movements that I could talk about, but I think that I think is something we really need to keep pushing. This is not something that's just a choice. That's where I really think that the white pro-abortion activists who sort of laid back after Roe were like, okay, now we're going to work on this, that, and the other. When immediately after Roe, Catholic groups were organizing to put human life amendments before Congress, every year. I think there've been over 500 proposals for that, So that's, I think, a really important lesson we can learn. And I think we are learning it. We are seeing more conversations, albeit they veiled, But we are seeing more conversations specifically talking about abortion as a human right today.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, the fall of Roe has been devastating, but has forced a lot of conversations and critical eye on how much it lacked, I think, at least in our movement space. So thank you so much for providing that historical context. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of housekeeping. So here are just some links so you can follow us on social media. Save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar for May. That will be about fetal personhood, the anti-abortion agenda. That will take place on Tuesday, May 28th at noon Eastern Standard Time. Okay, and so we're going to jump into Q&A. We have a couple of lined up. I think this is for any panelist, so I'll dive in. Miriam asked, how do people tackle the, quote, abortion not as birth control, end quote, sentence? I've been tackling from a perspective that abortion might be the only form of birth control for some folks due to health conditions or abusive relationships. And at the core, that person gets to decide what medications they want to take or not. So wondering if there's any sort of advice that they can add to their approach. Any panelists that would like to take it, feel free.
I can jump in if that's okay, Jess. This is Kim. I think that this is something that I hear consistently. And one of the ways that I approach this in the classroom is to remind people that abortion medically is defined as the termination of a pregnancy. And the pregnancy is defined as, any number of things. There's sort of these vague kind of medical definitions. And so in essence, I say, if you want to think about birth control as something that stops a live birth, then yeah, you can think about abortion as birth control. And especially nowadays when we're seeing, the Comstock law, which was that law that prohibited birth control from being disseminated through the mail in the 1870s, they're bringing that back up, especially in reference to the abortion, that 1864 law that's been resurrected in Arizona. So we are already seeing bills across the country in different states being proposed that are characterizing like birth control pills and, not diaphragms, but IUDs as abortion. And so I think that, maybe just saying, well, how do you define birth control? And if you define it as this, then yeah, and so what? Now, that may be too flip or whatever, but that's just how I approach it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Garnett or Sarah, would either of you like to chime in, or I can move on to the next question too?
I guess this is Garnet. I would also be interested if Sarah has any thoughts about this, but as a journalist, my inclination is always to ask people questions. So I think along the lines of what Professor Little was just saying is like, a lot of times when people will say things like that to me, especially if it's in the context of my work, but also in my personal life, I'll just ask them like, okay, and if someone is using birth control or abortion as birth control, what problem do you have with that? What's your concern about that? And sometimes people can articulate an actual concern, but a lot of times they can't because that is the type of talking point that they've just heard recycled over and over again. And when you really ask some more questions, especially in terms of like, okay, maybe that's not a choice you would want to make, but are you harmed by someone else making those types of choices? It's actually kind of hard for people to come up with an answer. And I think if you can ask those questions in kind of a neutral way, it can be a good way of redirecting a conversation rather than trying to tell someone that they're wrong. Is just ask more questions and say, what do you mean by that? I find is often a really effective response to any number of things.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And it sort of leads to my next question that I want to kick over to Jane. Very similar. How you talked earlier, Jane, about the I'm pro-choice but argument. Again, these are all like anti-abortion general like talking points that get recycled in our conversations. How do you respond when someone says I'm pro-choice but?
Oh, sorry, was that for me?
Yes.
This is Sarah.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry. I wrote Jane in my notes. I'm so sorry, Sarah. Yes, that was
Totally
real.
fine.
Thank you.
That's totally fine. No, that's such a good question. I think like similar to what Garnett and Kim have said, it's like getting to really the root of that question. Like, okay, abortion isn't birth control, but like for some people it is. So like, is the root of that like your own stigma around multiple abortions, right? And so even for the like people who are, you know, I'm pro-choice, but I feel like I really just turn to I feel like at this point I am less, I think, like willing to kind of like beat around the bush or like be a little bit, not like that I'm harsh, but like less willing to like be a little more gentle. And so I feel like I'm just very upfront around like, okay, you're pro-choice but X. So like instead of just like throwing a bunch of like hypothetical, maybe traumatizing scenarios of possible like, you know, abortion stories, instead of like kind of leaning on that, which is a lot of like what we're already seeing in like public narratives. I think it more has to do with like the very simple, like, you know, for the pro-choice but arguments, it's like just getting to the root, like what are you actually kind of like, what is the stigma really coming from? Is it like something that is personal, or is it just like maybe an article that you saw, maybe like a line that you heard from someone, you know, on a podcast or something else? So like I think kind of getting more to the root of that and analyzing it there, and then kind of like replacing where that came from with like, well, like getting closer to a place where it's just like, no, all abortions are valid. Like it's literally essential healthcare. There's no situation where like I personally wouldn't think that someone needs an abortion. And so I think if like all else fails, just like reaffirming my own personal stances and like again, like not compromising and like I don't know, honestly like modeling what it looks like to move away from the I'm pro-choice but.
Absolutely. All about stigma busting, and that's why we had this panel today. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Layla, for organizing and gathering these wonderful panelists. Thank you, Garnett, Sarah, and Kimberly for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and take care.